Welcome, everybody. We're going to wait a few minutes for everyone to get in before we get started. Welcome to those of you just joining us. My name is Jonathan Edelman. I'm the curatorial associate here at the museum. We're going to wait just a few minutes for everybody to get in, and then we'll get started.
Ah. Is that better or worse?
I like the light. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. We're waiting for the people to be able to get into the webinar, and then we'll start in just a minute. All right, why don't we get started? Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to share the screen with all of you so that you can have some visuals while I talk. Okay. All right, welcome to the Capital Jewish Museum Groundbreaking Festival. My name is Jonathan Edelman, and I'm the curatorial associate here at the museum. Tonight, I get the great honor of also being the moderator of this truly fantastic panel. But before we begin with our discussion, I want to take a few minutes to share a little bit about the museum and this festival with all of you. Building the Capital Jewish Museum has been years in the making. We've been hard at work designing exhibits, raising funds, and collecting stories that show the intersection of Judaism and American democracy here in the nation's capital. Over the last few months, our work has not stopped. We've been busy combing through online archives and brainstorming programs from our kitchens and living rooms, like many of you may be, all in an effort to bring together a museum that is not only uniquely Jewish in DC, but also another hub of our community. Those of you who live in Washington might remember back in January 2019, when there was that synagogue that drove through downtown Washington. That was us. Those of you who know us well know that driving synagogues through DC has kind of been our thing for the last 50 years. But I promise we are done moving the building. It is now set in place in its new home at 3rd and F Street Northwest, having undergone significant restoration. And in 2022, it will sit as the centerpiece of the new Capital Jewish Museum. The museum will be free to all and open for programs as well as special events. We will have a multi-purpose auditorium for speakers and holiday gatherings, a community action lab that not only fosters curiosity, but inspires change, and a temporary gallery space that will bring in exhibitions from museums from around the world. Our permanent exhibition will explore Jewish identity and the history of Jewish Washington through the lens of civic engagement. It strives to tell stories of individuals like the 3 we will hear from here tonight. But in order to open our doors for all of you, we need to build the museum first. And that's what has brought us all together this evening. This week, we are celebrating the museum's groundbreaking with a festival full of virtual events, including this one, more of which you will hear about at the end of our evening. Should you have any questions about the museum itself or the festival, please write them in the chat, and members of the museum staff who will identify themselves will be happy to answer them. If you have questions about our discussion or for our panelists, please ask them in the Q&A box. We're going to leave some time at the end to answer as many of your questions as we can. Now, let's dive into one of those stories of Jewish Washington with Bet Mishpachah, the first LGBTQ synagogue in our nation's capital. I am honored that we are joined tonight by Jocelyn Kaplan, Larry Neff, and Stuart Sotsky, all of whom played instrumental roles in the founding and shaping of Bet Mishpachah. I would like now for each individual to introduce themselves and share a bit about their experience as it relates to tonight's discussion. Jocelyn?
Hi, my name is Jocelyn Kaplan, and there are actually 2 events that brought me to Bet Mishpachah. The first started back in Limerick, New York, where I grew up. I was a member of Temple Emmanuel. And one Thanksgiving, I wandered into the synagogue and asked to speak to the rabbi. That was Rabbi Harold Saperstein. The secretary led me in, and I mentioned to the rabbi, or alluded to him, something about being gay, because in those days you wouldn't actually come out and say something like that. And to my great surprise, he walked over to his bookshelf and he grabbed an article on being gay and Jewish. And this was in the early 1970s. What happened after that was most interesting. He actually called me at home on Shabbos evening and asked if I would light the candles during services that evening. And to me, that said to me, it was okay to be gay and Jewish. And there was actually one more event that occurred, and that had to do with my time at Northwestern University. I had to take some time off of work and because I wasn't feeling well. So I left school and I came home, and once I was able to resume my work, I was hired as a stock boy at Sam Goody Records in Green Acres on Long Island. But what was interesting is that from the day that I started work, I never carried any records. And so I realized immediately that I was being treated differently because I was a woman. And this experience was new to me because in the academic world, I'd never experienced this discrimination. So when I returned to Northwestern University, I returned as a feminist, and I revived a women's group that was called Women at Northwestern. Now, this group had existed previously, but had always fallen apart when the organizers graduated from Northwestern. And I was determined to create a group in a way that would exist after I graduated. I was able to get a building on campus for our group, and this helped its existence. And we also brought Betty Friedan to the university to speak. These were some of the experiences that led me to Bet Mishpachah.
Larry?
I'm a 2nd-generation native Washingtonian. My father was born and raised in DC and worked for the Heck Company. My mother was from Atlantic City, New Jersey. And I grew up in Silver Spring. They moved out in 1948, and I grew up at Orthodox, although then it was known as MCJC. And my brother and I were bar mitzvah there. My sisters were confirmed. My mother sang in the choir for 18 years. And then when I was at the University of Maryland, I became active and actually lived in an alternative Hillel house that was called Brei Ra. And we had a chavurah every Friday night and a coffee house every Saturday night. And I lived there for 2 years and made some of the best friends of my life that I'm still very close to. And the rabbi there at the time was Rabbi Bob Sachs, who was a wonderful leader of Hillel. And later he became the rabbi at Bet Mishpachah for 18 years. And he's now our rabbi emeritus and is still much loved by the whole congregation. I studied, although I had various majors at the University of Maryland, the one constant thing was studying Jewish, taking 30 credits in Jewish studies, sort of like a minor. And later on, I started to work for the federal government, and I worked for 30 years for the US Department of Transportation. And the last 3 years, I was the deputy CFO for the department. And I've been involved with Bet Mishpachah since about April 1977.
Thank you. Stuart.
Hi, I'm Stuart Sotsky. I'm a founding member of Bet Mishpachah from 1975 and have served on the board of directors and as past president. I'm also a member of the Human Rights Campaign, which is the largest LGBT political advocacy organization, and a member of A Wider Bridge, which is an organization that supportively links North American Jewish LGBT communities with those in Israel. I'm a physician, a psychiatrist, and a retired professor of psychiatry at George Washington University School of Medicine, having trained previously at Johns Hopkins and Yale. And I was just thinking today, I almost forgot, I was a visiting professor at Hadassah Hospital, Hebrew University Medical School, while I was on sabbatical in 1988 during the first Intifada. Quite an experience.
Wow.
I'm a founding member of the Association of Gay and Lesbian Psychiatrists, and our national group, and the American Psychiatric Association. And I've served on the board of the Washington Psychiatric Society. My family moved here in 1961, and I grew up in Silver Spring, went to Montgomery Blair High School, and we were members of Temple Israel, which no longer exists. I live in Cleveland Park in DC, where I enjoy hiking and gardening and biking and swimming, and have actively enjoyed the theater, classical music, and art scene here in Washington, so that this year I became just recently a member of the Theater J Council at the EDCJCC.
Thank you all. So Stuart, I'll start with you, since you had mentioned Bet Mishpachah in 1975. If you'll sort of take us back and set the scene for us, what Washington, D.C., but specifically what the sort of LGBT community and the gay rights movement was like when Bet Mishpachah was sort of coming to be in 1975.
It was a very different world in society for gay and lesbian people at that time, of course. It was only in 1969, just 6 years before, that we had the Stonewall Rebellion in New York City, which was the touchstone of the gay liberation movement. And Gay Activist Alliance, and there had been other smaller protest movements in the past. But it was in 1973, 2 years before we founded the congregation, that the pathological diagnosis of homosexuality was removed by the American Psychiatric Association from its diagnostic nomenclature, and followed by concurrence of all the other major mental health and medical associations. With the major Jewish denominations still considering homosexuality as religiously prohibited and unacceptable at the time, there really were no synagogues that accepted gay or lesbian people or relationships openly. No synagogues would have sponsored or hosted our congregation in their facility. And there were only a very few university rabbis, rather than congregational rabbis, who were informally supportive of our group as we were founding. None of our members would have been comfortable in mainstream synagogues, because they were all mostly closeted socially and professionally, and realistically feared discrimination. such as loss of security clearances and other legal, personal, and job consequences. At that time, gays were legally prohibited from serving in the military, foreign service, and intelligence agencies, and were considered security risks for blackmail. Gays were prohibited from licensure as physicians or admission to the bar as lawyers in many, if not most states. So it was very important as we formed, as you'll hear in a moment, to protect the identities of those people who were joining us, our members, membership lists, mailings, advertising, and so forth. But the motivation, I think, for almost everybody was the need to express and affirm and integrate their Jewish and gay identities. Men and women raised in Jewish homes with strong Jewish educational and community affiliations, which they did not want to surrender to live their authentic LGBT lives. Neither did they want to hide their identity as Jews in the gay community of the time, in which many people met anonymously or often in bars or clubs, where racial and religious prejudices were often evident. The early members were eager to meet other gay and lesbian Jews socially in a safe and respectful environment, make new friends, and many developed lasting committed love relationships in the congregation. Unlike today, it was very difficult for many people to live together or sustain a lasting committed relationship without that threatening to reveal their sexuality publicly. It was also virtually impossible for male couples to raise children together through adoption or surrogacy, unless they were children from a prior heterosexual marriage. It was difficult for lesbians to find a cooperative doctor or clinic to have a child by donor insemination at that time. In either case, the legal status and protections for the non-biological parents were not yet established at all. So when we formed, I guess I'll save this for later and I'll stop there.
Thanks. Larry, how do you start a synagogue? I mean, a lot of times synagogues are these like, decades and decades old things, and it's still today we have new synagogues that are established, but what was it like in terms of trying to get Bet Mishpachah started in this community?
Well, you heard from Stuart about the need for people to try to meet each other and to try to affirm our lives, all of the different aspects of our lives together. I'm not sure how many of the original members were aware, but actually there were gay synagogues founded in Los Angeles in 1972, in New York in 73, and Philadelphia. So in 1975, a group of gay men at that time got together in one member's house for Rosh Hashanah and had some Rosh Hashanah services in his living room. And that's really how it started. And from there, it gradually grew. They were having services once a month. We met first at a church at 10th and G Northwest, and later moved to 4th and I Southwest, when it was a much different neighborhood than it is today.
Oh, yes.
Later, we moved to National City Christian Church, and in 1997, we were invited to become tenants in the Edlovich DC JCC, which has been our home ever since. So shortly after that beginning, within a couple of years, the group had been established. Some of the early members helped set up bylaws and get incorporated and get our 501c3 tax exempt status, which was important for donations. And services quickly jumped to twice a month on Friday nights, and eventually to very quickly after that to all 4 Friday nights of the month, which is what we have now. Plus we have 2 Saturday morning services every month as we go through. So it really evolved kind of quickly. It grew quickly. And some of the friendships that were formed in those early years have continued all of these years later, 45 years later. We have, I think, almost 80 members who have been members for more than 36 years. They're going to be honored with at High Holiday services.
Wow. So starting Rosh Hashanah, so this week is really your 45th anniversary. That's exciting.
45th anniversary and the 46th year of High Holiday services.
Wow.
Maybe you should say something about the High Holiday services and the development too. They were very special.
The first ones?
one of the things that really has made it special is starting around maybe 1980 or so, a few people got together and started singing, and they evolved into our wonderful choir, which is called Takshitim. And they made a CD in 2000. They varied from 6 to 12 voices with a couple of different directors over the years, but they just added absolutely wonderful element to our high holiday services. We also now have a chazan for the high holiday services, who is terrific. So we have a combination of them. And this year, due to circumstances, we will be on Zoom. And fortunately, we have that CD from the choir because they were not able to rehearse and perform this year. So inserting, files from the CD into the high holiday services, the appropriate point when they sing the Janowski and when they sing Solomoni Rossi, wonderful classic pieces as well as modern pieces.
Very nice. So Jocelyn, at this time, in addition to sort of the gay rights movement really picking up, there was a lot going on in the women's rights movement as well. And so I wonder if you could speak to how you got involved with Bet Mishpachah. You talked a little bit in the opening, but then also, as I believe Larry had mentioned, or maybe Stuart, that it was started by a few gay men in someone's living room. How did women sort of get involved with the community?
Well, I actually moved to the Washington, D.C. area in 1975, and that's just when the congregation was getting going. And when I moved there, I didn't have any friends, and I was looking for a way to find people who would be similar to me. And I saw an ad in the Gay Blade, which is what it was called. Now it's the Washington Blade. And it was about Bet Mishpachah. And I thought to myself, well, gay and Jewish, well, that might work. So I actually went to services, but it was mostly men who were at services. So I continued to go intermittently. And in 1978, I was actually asked to run for a position on the new board of directors. And I was specifically asked to focus on getting more women to attend services and to join the congregation. So the way I went about doing that is that I decided to have a special women's outreach service, and I invited a speaker by the name of Linda Kuzmak. I also had a list of people who had signed up at our booth at Gay Pride Day, and I called each one of those women twice and invited them to come to this special service. And we actually had a fairly good turnout. And after that, I organized 2 more women's outreach services. And then we decided to have a women's outreach service on the first Friday night of each month. And that worked really well because women knew that if they came on a first Friday night, there would be other women there. And later, we started a women's potluck before the women's outreach service. And gradually, more and more women began to attend, and they became leaders in the congregation.
Thank you. So, Stuart, you had alluded to this a little bit before, but I wonder if you could speak to sort of the perception of the broader Jewish community
Right.
at the time of establishment.
I just wanted to add one thing first to what Jocelyn said, and I think that was really important at the time, remembering this was 1975, that this congregation pioneered having women counted for the minyan, serving on the bima, called for aliyot, and serving on the board and as president, as Jocelyn mentioned. And also that it brought a lot of Jewish feminist theology and thinking into our services and our liturgy, which we'll hear about a little later from Larry. But I think that was a very important contribution. In terms of the Jewish community, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy at the beginning. The Jewish Community Council denied membership to Bet Mishpachah for 13 years because of strong opposition by Orthodox congregations until the council leadership, supported by the Federation, worked with us to gain membership in 1988. And we were so pleased by the overwhelming support of the representatives of many other Jewish community organizations at that time. I was the first representative to the council, and I'm serving again as representative this year. So it all comes around.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that I think it says a lot to Bet Mishpachah that even after 13 years of sort of being kept out, so to speak, that you still wanted to be part of the larger community. It could have been very easy to sort of say, fine, we'll just do our own thing, but you wanted to sort of maintain that relationship, or I guess establish it.
I think we felt that we wanted to participate in the larger Jewish community, and we also wanted the Jewish community to recognize our group and the situation of gay and lesbian Jews who were in all the congregations but were closeted and had no voice. But at the time, the only other Jewish organization that was banned from the Jewish Community Council was an anti-Zionist group that was against the state of Israel. And we were pretty miffed about that.
I can imagine.
One of the ways we reached out to some of the congregations was we always sent our newsletter to the rabbi or to all the congregations in the metropolitan Washington area. It really paid off. I remember in one particular case where there was a man who was married with 4 kids and started coming out, and there was gossip in the congregation, and he and his wife went to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of the gossip." And he handed him our newsletter and said, "There's a place for you. I want you to go to Bet Mishpachah." And he ended up becoming vice president of the congregation. So it was important to us that we reached out. We also had a speakers bureau for many years where we were invited to go and speak in congregations around the metropolitan area, often to maybe a confirmation class or something like that, and tell them a little congregation.
And we also had, as part of a number of congregations' social justice programs, we had a number of youth groups who came to visit us to attend services from time to time.
Right.
That was our connection.
So Larry, Stuart had mentioned a little bit about the liturgy, and I think a lot of people in Washington might know, but if you could speak to the Bet Mishpachah liturgy and sort of how it came to be and how it took shape and sort of what it means as this sort of the heart of the synagogue.
We started very early in the late 1970s to update the liturgy. I think the original group was using the old Union prayer book, maybe from the 1940s, and people were not very happy with that. And we wanted a more participatory style with more Hebrew, more singing, a balance of Hebrew and English. And so we started to put together our own service booklets. The first one was a small pamphlet. And at that time, we started to make references to God, not gender specific. So we stopped saying king, we said sovereign, we stopped referring to God, he or his or Lord. And out of that evolved into the first hardcover edition of our Siddur, which was finally published around 1990, 91, I think, which as far as we know was the first hardcover edition of any Siddur anywhere that was published with gender neutral references to God in both Hebrew and in English, and with gender inclusive references to people in both Hebrew and English. So we added Hebrew words to some of the prayers. We modified things. We added in references to women, for example, Miriam. We added in the matriarchs. And recently we took a tip from CBST in New York and added in the other 2 wives, Bilhah and Zilpah, who are also mothers of the 12 tribes. And Jocelyn mentioned Dr. Linda Kuzmak, who taught a course on Jewish feminism, and that sort of has continued throughout our liturgy. In more recent years, there's been a strong emphasis to add in prayers for the trans community. For example, there's a beautiful prayer, Twilight People, by Rabbi Reuben Zellman, who is trans at a Reform temple in Berkeley, California. So we have a lot of readings of that, and a lot of members of the congregation have written beautiful pieces for our liturgy over the years. And in December 2017, we published the second hardcover edition of our Siddur, which is 460 pages with Shabbat and holiday services. It has a lot of tachlis. It has really wonderful content, beautiful poetry, beautiful readings. And we were very, very proud of that. And also in early years, Even before anybody thought about making gay marriage legal, we had couples come to us and say, we want a religious ceremony to recognize our commitment with each other. So in our usual way, we had a committee talk about policy. They came up with a policy. The board approved it. And we had a series of gay weddings. Again, not legally recognized at the time, but it religiously affirmed people's relationships. And as Stuart mentioned, we've had many couples with long-term relationships. 35, 40 years now, a couple just celebrated their relationship. So that was an important thing for the congregation. Our first Torah scroll that we acquired was one of the Holocaust Czech memorial scrolls on loan from the Westminster Synagogue in London, and then later bought another Sefer Torah in Brooklyn that I think was written in Russia just before the revolution, maybe was never mounted on wooden rollers on Etzei Chaim, or ever used until we bought it. And we use both of those now in the two beautiful arcs that we have had over the years to house them. I also just want to mention that there have been a series of conferences as gay synagogues started in various cities around the country and around the world. We had conferences that started in a group called the World Congress of LGBTQ Jews, which is still around. And one of our members, Barbara Goldberg, is now president of that organization. And for many, many years, there were conferences that we just loved getting together with people from other congregations, sharing ideas with them about liturgy, about programs. Just being together was so affirming and such a wonderful experience. And Bet Mishpachah hosted one of the early ones in 1985 at the Omni Shoreham Hotel. We had 350 people. Dr. Evelyn Beck was, I believe at the time, head of the Women's Studies program at the University of Maryland, was our guest speaker on Friday night. We had a big party on Saturday night. And one of the things that really surprised people from other cities was at the opening dinner on Thursday night, the mayor of Washington at that time, Mayor for Life, Marion Barry, came in person to deliver a proclamation. These are our gay Jewish days in the city of Washington. And there was, I'm sure, no other city in the country at that time, no other major city who had a mayor who would have been willing to deliver a proclamation like that in person to a gay Jewish conference. And the keynote speaker that night was, at the time, very still positive, Congressman Barney Frank from Massachusetts, who spoke then and also spoke at one of our later conferences when he was fully out.
Wow, that is incredible. I mean, you know, something that, just from what we've talked about so far, you know, the level of sort of perseverance and just sort of drive, you know, when the Jewish community, there was no place for you in the Jewish community, you started your own synagogue. And, you know, when they're, you know, despite marriage not being legal, you guys created Jewish marriage services. And you just, the level of persistence is really inspiring. And I think it's, you know, especially people in the LGBTQ community my age, often take for granted a lot of those things. You know, being out and working in the federal government, I have lots of friends who do that here. And that was something for decades, you know, something we had talked about before we went live, you know, with like Frank Chisholm, that was his whole fight, you know, being able to be open and you know, we are able to sort of not have to think a second thought because of people like you all who made that possible for us. I
would add also that, you know, that even now, gradually, as there's been increased acceptance and inclusion from Reconstructionist, Reform, and more lately conservative movements and congregations, and there have been some of the LGBT synagogues have affiliated with those movements. Others who have closed as independent synagogues have joined with mainstream congregations. But there's still a continuing need for a dedicated LGBT congregational community, despite the competition for membership with these alternative congregations. And I think part of it is building on what Larry said a moment ago, which is, while it's wonderful that, you know, we can be accepted in mainstream congregations now, there's no other congregation that pays the kind of attention, both in liturgy and ritual and services and support, to LGBT lives and life cycle events and celebration of our relationships.
Right. Right.
I wanted to add also that when we first started to have services in the mid-70s, Larry led services every single Friday night. How many years did you do that, Larry?
3.5 years.
3.5 years every single Friday night.
And then I saw the error of my ways and helped other people.
Yeah.
You train the next generation.
Exactly.
And now, I mean, this is a big issue. Larry mentioned the increase in liturgy for transgender members, but I think also that, you know, we've done, and since the women's outreach that Jocelyn described in recent years, as we've done a lot of outreach to the younger generations of LGBT Jews in the Washington region, and then also to trans Jews who frankly were neglected in the early years and weren't apparent to us, but are now, and we have trans members, and I think that's really wonderful. And we also have straight allies who are members.
Absolutely.
Jocelyn, I want to go back a little bit to what Stuart had alluded to before in terms of Bet Mishpachah giving women the opportunity to be in a lot of leadership roles, both in the sanctuary and in the boardroom. But, you know, again, this is something that today we sort of take for granted in a lot of Jewish spaces. But if you'll just talk a little bit about what that was like.
I grew up in a Reform congregation, and in my synagogue, women were involved. And they were also on the Bima. So it really wasn't so unusual for me when I got to Bet Mishpachah, because it wasn't so different from what I had experienced as I grew up. But women were encouraged right from the beginning to get involved. And we were always looking for service leaders, and we were looking for women service leaders because we wanted to have women involved in the congregation, and that's how you bring women into the congregation. So it wasn't something that I wasn't accustomed to, but I think Larry might be able to speak more to that.
We've had a large cadre of women service leaders over the years, darshanim and people involved. We've also had several women rabbis.
Yes.
After Rabbi Sachs, we've had a couple of other women rabbis serve the congregation. At the moment, our new rabbi who started last July, who everybody absolutely loves, Rabbi Jake Singer-Beelan, he's absolutely a delightful person, very learned, wonderful, spiritual, calm, low-key, he's just wonderful. Everybody loves him. So we've been served by different groups. Rabbi Sachs, of course, is still our rabbi emeritus, and we still think of him as our rabbi too. There's really been an emphasis, and some of the best liturgy, I would say, that's been in the new Siddur has been written by women in the congregation. And I think for a lot of women, maybe growing up, especially those who grew up in the conservative movement, maybe they didn't have any opportunities to do some of those things back in the 1960s and 70s, and Bet Mishpachah has really been a wonderful place for their work to flower.
Right.
And I would add, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You go first, Stuart.
Well, I was going to add that also thinking about the larger gay and lesbian community in 1975, most of the women's organizations then were quite separatist. And we made a decision very early on. Jocelyn was very much a part of that, you know, that's not the way that we wanted to go in establishing a Jewish congregation. We wanted both men and women to be integrated and included in the congregation, and it should be an egalitarian congregation. And I think that that turned out to be a very important decision. Jocelyn?
I wanted to mention that a turning point for our congregation was when we hired our first rabbi, Rabbi Sachs.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was known in the greater Jewish community, it really created a bridge for us that we hadn't had previously. And it really made a huge difference for our congregation. And one of the things that Larry mentioned in our earlier conversations was that we were beginning to experience deaths in our congregation from AIDS. And well, Larry, why don't you go ahead and tell the story?
Well, we, in general, Washington, D.C. was not as hard hit as some other cities, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, but we did have people in the congregation who became ill and who died. At that time, it was before we had hired a rabbi, we were completely lay-led. One of our members who had been president of the congregation and very involved for a long time, actually, he and I went to Northwood High School together. David Green, Zichrono Livracha, passed away, and his parents were members of Washington Hebrew congregation. And so Dr. Alfred Munzer and I conducted a funeral at Washington Hebrew for David. And afterwards, we and other people who had been involved with that were just so drained. And we said, we're not really trained for this. We really need we need to professionalize this. And that's when we first hired Rabbi Sachs, who, as I mentioned, has been with us in one form or another for all the years since. And the congregation did a really excellent job, I think, with the help of another member, Jay Stone, who unfortunately has also passed away, not of AIDS. She set up a whole bereavement support program for us. And we've had, if something happens, we have a phone system ready to go, and to help people plan a funeral and to conduct a funeral if necessary, for Shiva services, and to provide a meal of consolation in the home. And the way the congregation really comes around to support people. I mean, a lot of people are at the age when we've had parents pass away, and they may go home someplace for a burial and Shiva and come back and then have a Shiva here for their Washington Bet Mishpachah family. And people really show up for those things. And even people who don't know them well want to go and say, we're part of your community, we support you. And that's been something quite wonderful. And then in more recent years, we actually have bought a part of the Elizabethgrad Cemetery in Southeast Washington. And we have a section of that cemetery with a large stone marker that says Bet Mishpachah, which is quite wonderful. We've unfortunately had 2 burials there, but it's really addressed a need for the congregation that we've now met.
I would just add to what Jocelyn and Larry said, that the AIDS epidemic is really devastating for our members, and not just those that we lost directly, but many of our friends and colleagues. And it really stimulated the growth of political advocacy and activism, as well as community support for ill and dying members. And several members of the congregation, Larry mentioned Dave Stone, were active volunteers and members of the board of Whitman Walker Clinic during that time. And I think, and also the other part of our congregation that would really developed in addition was the Bikur Cholim committee to deal with members who were ill, and that has served now for people with many other life-threatening illnesses.
I wonder, you had mentioned that you had done the funeral at Washington Hebrew. I know that the relationship with the general Jewish community was not always on the best terms. Did rabbis or synagogues come to you when they had congregants dealing with HIV or AIDS? I mean, a lot of times a lot of people weren't acknowledging it, but I wonder if, since you had sort of established yourself and you had sent letters to the rabbis and stuff, if you had sort of become this spot for the Jewish community.
I'm not really sure. I don't remember if we had many people come to us for that. I mean, generally, those kind of things are handled with, if someone is a member of a congregation, then it's a service for the member and for the family to help them through bereavement. But it was a time when many of our members lost a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 4 dozen friends in our 30s, which was not at all a normal part of life to go through. And unfortunately today, the pandemic today is reminiscent of that, that pandemic that we had with AIDS.
I just want to mention 2 other things that we haven't touched on yet before we run out of time. But one is that there are now developed other gay Jewish groups in Washington in recent years. Nice Jewish Girls, Nice Jewish Boys, Gayim, GLOW, which is a program of the Jewish Community Center. We've done a lot of combined programs with each of them. And one of them that I think might be of interest to our viewers is that beginning in 2014, and we began to hold joint annual Pride Shabbat services at the 6 and I Historic Synagogue with that group and with GLOW, and that continues till today. And we've also, while early on, with the many pride marches. We usually marched on our own, but in recent years, we've been very pleased to be joined by other Jewish congregations and their members who are supporting LGBT rights.
And actually, that's how I first learned about Mishpachah. I moved to DC in 2016, in June 2016, and my friend's like, oh, we're gonna go to this synagogue that was built in 1908 in downtown Washington. And I was like, great. And they're like, it's for Friday night service for Pride Shabbat. And I was born and raised in Kansas, and I really hate when people connect it to Dorothy, but quite literally in that moment, I said, I'm not in Kansas anymore, because sitting in this beautiful, for those of you who know Sixth and I, this beautiful historic synagogue full of LGBTQ Jews celebrating the start of Pride, I was like, where am I? But it was that space that I had not seen before.
That's a wonderful story, and it reminds me also that in very recent years, on the day that we had heard from the Supreme Court affirming marriage equality, we had a speaker planned who was the Jewish community liaison for President Obama, who came, told us the whole story. He was at the Supreme Court. And then bunches of us went to the White House afterwards to see it all lit up in rainbow colors. And it was a wonderful affirmation.
Yeah, that was my first summer interning in Washington. And I was like, is DC always like this?
Yes, of course.
Yes and no in different ways. So we had some questions from the community, and I want to leave some time for that. One question that was asked from someone who lives in New York is talking about, you had mentioned some of the other LGBT synagogues, and the question is sort of about if there's a relationship between them today. New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and then maybe also speaking about what you think the similarities and differences are, if you can speak to that between some of them.
Well, I think the group I mentioned earlier, the World Congress of LGBTQ Jews, they maintain connections with all of the congregations in the U.S. and around the world. So there's information that's exchanged there. Also, a lot of our members, anytime we've gone traveling, if I'm in New York, I go to shul at CBST on a Friday night to experience it. They have a wonderful congregation with about 1,200 members, 3 rabbis, a fabulous music director. We invited their choir down once some years ago to sing at Bet Mishpachah with our choir, and that was a wonderful evening. So there's been connections through travel and through organizations, and we have always sent our newsletter to all of the other LGBTQ congregations, and they've always sent theirs to us. We used to keep a book on a table at the Onik Shabbat room after services of newsletters from around the country and around the world.
And some of the other congregations have also obtained and used our Siddur. And I think that we also have exchanged members. So as people move around the country for jobs and other things, we have a lot of members who've been from the New York congregation, from San Francisco and New York, and vice versa.
Right. This past Yom Kippur, I found myself in New York, and I went to CBST for their Kol Nidre services. For those of you who don't know, they literally do it in the Javits Center. They obviously won't be able to this year. There were 3,600 people, and the Javits Center is all glass on the river, and they lower all the lights, and it's sunset. It's very dramatic, very camp, and it's quite an experience.
The main difference between Bet Mishpachah and those others is really size, and so New York, LA, even San Francisco, have much larger congregations than we do, but the size of the community here is smaller.
Right. I was about to say the difference between Washington and New York is also similarly different. We have a question about a LGBT rights leader, Frank Kameny, who was local, who was in Washington, who I had mentioned before, and who is Jewish. And they're asking if there was, if Frank Kameny influenced Bet Mishpachah in any way, if there was any relationship, or any memories you might have about Frank Kameny. And if one of you want to speak briefly about who he was.
Well, Frank Kameny was a federal employee who lost his job, I think in the late 1950s. And then for the rest of his life, it was his mission to try to get gay rights for employment and in other areas. And he was really an incredible leader of the nationwide gay rights movement for decades and decades. Matter of fact, there's a street sign at 17th and Q that says 17th Street is Frank Kameny Way. Just around the corner from where I live. It's sort of the heart, or what's left of the heart of the gay neighborhood. I don't think religion was very important to Frank in his life, so he was never very involved in the religious life of the synagogue, but certainly we were always very aware, everyone in Washington was very aware of Frank Kameny.
Right. I wonder if you could speak to a little bit, we have a question about sort of when Bet Mishpachah was being established and when the gay rights movement was really sort of large and growing in the 1970s, if LGBTQ Jews faced any anti-Semitism, either within the movement or within the LGBT community.
Well, I think I mentioned earlier that I think socially, discrimination still existed in personal relationships. Both racial and religious discrimination. I think that lessened over time. The fact that we had this congregation and we had a number of interfaith events over many years with the rise of LGBT churches, which occurred during the same period of time, was helpful in terms of gaining mutual respect and support. And I think today the issue is really more from the left, and in the LGBT movement, that there's been a rise of anti-Zionism. And we've seen this acted out in a number of conferences that excluded lesbian Jewish groups and others that were really quite anti-Semitic. There's been a protest of that by a number of Jewish groups, including a wider bridge. And there's been some retrenchment and increased inclusiveness since that. But I think it still remains an issue.
Thank you. A sort of more practical question for today. Someone wants to know how many members there are today and how sort of that, I mean, I know you said it's grown, but how the membership has sort of changed over the years.
There's about 200 members, that's individual members today. And we have some members who are the children of members who are, became members when they were born into the congregation, and they're now married and having kids of their own. So it's really evolved over the generations.
Okay, this is
one of the things that's perhaps a little different for our congregation as the original generation of members has aged, is because unlike mainstream synagogues that have schools and a lot of bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and so forth, we've had to work extra hard to encourage members to join from younger generations. And that's an ongoing issue.
I'm muted, sorry. I do want to share a few pictures from your archives that Brian shared with us earlier. Let's see if I can get my screen to share again. This first one is, I would say, definitely my favorite. Okay, come on. Zoom, work with me. Let's see.
Oh.
So, who wants to talk about this one? Oh gosh.
Larry, you want to say where this is?
Well, I think this is probably one of the early gay pride festivals or parades. We always had a table there. You see our banner. That was an early banner, which members of the congregation made, I believe. And it was always a good way to tell the congregation, to tell the city about us and to try to recruit new members. We would always ask them to sign up and add them to our mailing list. And that continues today. For example, in addition to the Pride Festival, we always have a booth there. And we also have a booth at the 17th Street Festival every year where we let people know about the congregation. And I think it's hard to see in the photo, but what we did to make a little money at there is we sold homemade Kugel and Dr. Brown cream soda. That was our contribution to the Pride Festival.
I just love the idea of a big Pride. I don't know if was this when it was at like the P Street Beach, or where was it at this time?
That's what it sort of looks like.
Looks like
Yeah, I think it's P Street. But I just love the idea of like the big Pride Festival and there's Kugel and Dr. Brown's. that's where I'd be. And then do you want to talk a little bit about this one outside the steps of the JCC?
So this is when we marched with our Torahs to the JCC when we joined as early member program of the congregation, and you see the chuppah and the Torahs with members of the congregation, and with Rabbi Sachs on the right, who looks like he's reading something out loud.
Yes,
It was
he
a
is.
very proud moment.
It was.
And it was the first time that we were in the center of the Jewish community, as opposed to being outcasts in basements of churches.
And this looks like maybe Constitution Avenue, a pride march.
It's a Pride March, maybe Pennsylvania Avenue. I don't know.
Oh yeah, you're probably right.
Larry, is that you?
That's me in the front in the khaki shorts and the white shirt.
There you go.
I love
A few
that.
years ago.
only a few. So I want, before we conclude, and I do want to share a little bit more about the festival, but I would like you guys, since it is your 45th anniversary, but also it is our high holidays start this week, if you'll talk a little bit about what you'll be doing this year.
Larry?
Our holiday services have always been very special, and we've been in various venues for them. This year, of course, they will be by Zoom webinar, and we have never sold tickets for our holidays. We've always just asked for a donation, but we have a large congregation gets together, often in person. We've had 200 or more people for high holiday services. We have a wonderful cantor, Rabbi Ben Shalva, who serves as our chazan for the high holidays. As I mentioned, we'll have recordings of our fabulous choir singing classic and contemporary pieces from the liturgy. And our Rabbi Jake Singer-Beelan will be leading services. He's a halftime rabbi, so he leads or gives the sermon at half of the high holiday services. And you can always get information about our high holiday and other services at our website, which is betmish.org.
And Larry, just to mention, we're also, for the services, we have our own LGBT machzor that the congregation developed that we use for the liturgy for high holidays.
Right, we've been using a machzor that the congregation, the members of the liturgy committee wrote in the mid-1990s. It's been 5 separate sort of paper-bound volumes. And this year, for the first time, we're going to be using a draft of what will be our new hardcover machzor, which we hope to publish next year, but it'll be on the screen. And it's a beautiful, beautiful machzor with wonderful, wonderful readings.
That's great.
Absolutely.
So I just want to mention to everyone, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is one event, part of our week-long virtual festival, celebrating our groundbreaking. And actually tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern is the groundbreaking, and you will be able to stream it live. It'll be streamed on our Facebook, but you can also register for that and a number of other free festival programs that will be going on through Wednesday night. You can learn more about them and register for the events, again, all free. If you visit our website, capitaljewishmuseum.org /groundbreaking, or a little thing will pop up for the groundbreaking. I really want to thank Jocelyn and Larry and Stuart. The Jewish LGBT community was something that I discovered once I came to Washington, and I really believe we have you all to thank for creating this type of community in Washington. So I'm glad we could all be together to speak, and I wish you all Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, for leading us.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.